I'm Vivian Ashcroft, 51 years old, and I spent nearly 30 years in the Army learning that a door you are trusted to guard is never a door you own. For most of my life, I gave the service everything: the deployments, the missed weddings, the ordinary years other people got to keep. But on my first morning as the new director of operations at a combatant command, a sergeant at the most secure door in the building put me in restraints and told me people like me don't just walk in. What I did next is the reason I'm telling you this. Have you ever been stopped, doubted, or dismissed by someone who had no idea who you were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. The morning I reported to the most secure building I had ever worked in, I sat in a rental car outside a gate I was not yet cleared to pass, watching the sky go from gray to the color of weak tea and thinking about doors. It is a strange thing to admit, but if you asked me to draw my life, I would not draw a map of the places I have lived or the ribbons on a rack. I would draw doors, gates, hatches, vaults, checkpoints, the heavy kind that seal with a sound like a held breath. Nearly 30 years in uniform, and I could draw you my whole life as a series of doors and the people who decided whether I could pass. I had spent most of those years being one of the people who decided. That is what command is, in the end. You stand at a threshold, and you say yes to the right person and no to the wrong one. And you carry the weight of being wrong in either direction. I had learned to carry it early, and I had learned it from a man who ran a gate in the desert like it was scripture. His name was Otis Beauchamp, and in the year 2001, he was a first sergeant, and I was a fire support officer, so new that my boots still looked like they belonged to someone else. We were on a fire base where the dust got into everything, into your teeth, into the seams of every document, into the little routines that were supposed to keep us alive. One afternoon, a supply contractor rolled up to our checkpoint, a man I had seen a dozen times, a man who brought us water and bad coffee and news from the larger base. I waved him through. I knew his face. I thought that was the same thing as knowing he was safe. Beauchamp stopped the truck himself. He checked the man, checked the manifest, checked the seal on the load, all of it slow and unbothered, while I stood there feeling my face go hot. When the truck finally rolled on, he turned to me, and he did not raise his voice, because he never needed to. "The door isn't yours to hand out, Lieutenant," he said. "It's yours to guard, for everybody, especially the ones you know." I have thought about that sentence more times than I have thought about almost anything else anyone has ever said to me. It sounds simple. It is not simple. It means that the door does not care whether you like the person standing at it. It does not care whether you recognize them, whether they are important, whether they are you. A door you are trusted to guard is never a door you own. The moment you start treating access as a favor you can grant to your friends, you have stopped guarding anything at all. I tested that lesson against myself more than once over the years, and the hardest test came in 2009, on a forward base, where I controlled the access to a small operations cell. A friend of mine, an officer I'd come up with, someone I trusted with my life and would have trusted with anyone's, arrived one night without the right credentials because a convoy had been hit and half of everyone's paperwork was still burning in a vehicle 2 valleys over. I wanted to wave her through. Every human part of me wanted to wave her through. I knew her face better than I knew my own family's by then. And I stood there at that threshold, and I heard Beauchamp in my ear, and I made her wait in the cold while I verified her the slow, correct way, because the door does not care that you love the person standing at it. She was angry with me for about a day. Then she told me quietly that she was glad I was the kind of officer who would make her own friends wait, because it meant the door would hold for the people she loved too. I never forgot that. A door you bend for the people you like is a door that will fail the people you have never met. I built a career on that idea, and the career cost what careers cost. I deployed when other people were home for the births and the funerals and the ordinary Tuesdays that turn out to be the whole of a life. My marriage thinned out over a decade of that. Quietly, without anyone to blame, until one year we admitted we had become 2 people who sent each other kind messages from different time zones. I watched my niece grow up in the small rectangle of a phone screen, her voice arriving a half-second late over bad connections, and I told myself the trade was worth it because someone had to hold the line, and I was good at holding it. There were costs that did not show up in any file. There was the sister's wedding I watched on a phone propped against a ration box. the reception happening at a normal hour on the other side of the world, while I sat in the dark, listening to a toast I could barely hear. There were the birthdays that became text messages, the friendships that became holiday cards, the slow narrowing of a life, down to the people who understood the schedule and the silences it required. I do not tell you this to be pitied. I tell you because I want you to understand that I did not arrive at that combatant command as someone who took thresholds lightly or who thought the rules were for other people. I had paid in the currency of an ordinary life for the right to stand at the biggest door of my career, and I had no intention of pretending that the paying entitled me to skip the line. I was good at it. I moved up. Captain in 2001, Major in 2008. Lieutenant Colonel in 2013 with a battalion to command. Colonel in 2018 with a brigade. I pinned on my first star in 2023 and my second this past spring. And with it came the assignment that had put me in that rental car at dawn. I was reporting in as the Director of Operations at a Unified Combatant Command, the J-3, the officer who runs the floor behind the most controlled door in the building. There was a symmetry to it that made me smile in the dark. I had spent nearly 30 years learning to guard doors, and I was starting the biggest job of my life stuck outside one, my badge not yet active, waiting on a gate guard to decide whether a 2-star general could come in from the cold. I did not know yet how literal that would get. I only knew, sitting there watching the sky go pale, that I had no intention of walking into that building like I owned it. Beauchamp had cured me of that a long time ago. I intended to walk in like a guest. By the time the gate guard checked my temporary paperwork and waved me onto the installation, the tea-colored sky had gone bright and ordinary, and I felt the small, clean nervousness of a first day. I did not feel dread. I want to be honest about that because of what came next. I did not walk into that morning braced for anything. I walked into it hopeful. The building itself was low and unremarkable, the way the important ones often are. All beige panels and antennas, and nothing to tell you that some of the most consequential decisions in the country moved through its interior. I parked where a young airman told me to park. I found the in-processing office where I had been told to report, and I began, without knowing it, to walk toward the door that would decide what kind of general I was going to be. Part of me, the part shaped by Beauchamp, was almost glad the badge was not ready. It meant I would have to earn my way in the ordinary way, at least for a few days like everyone else. I like that. I have always distrusted the version of rank that expects the world to melt out of its path. The best leaders I have known were the ones who could stand in a line, wait their turn, and let the standard apply to them the same as anyone. I would get my chance to prove I meant that. I would get it within the hour, and it would not look anything like the clean little test I had imagined. But at that moment, walking down a quiet corridor toward the in-processing office, with my cover under my arm and my orders in my hand, I felt only the thing you feel at the start of something you have worked your whole life to be ready for. I felt like I had finally reached the door I was meant to guard. I just had to get through it first. The in-processing office smelled like burnt coffee and toner, which is the smell of every military office everywhere, and it steadied me the way a familiar smell does. Behind the desk was my new aide, a major named Simone Faraday, 36 years old and sharp in the way that makes senior officers feel briefly lazy. She had my file open before I finished introducing myself, and she had already found the problem in it. "Ma'am," she said, "we have a wrinkle, and I want you to hear it from me before it becomes your morning." I liked her immediately for that sentence. I sat down across from her and told her to give it to me straight. The wrinkle was this. My orders had posted late. Not scandalously late, just late enough to miss a cutoff that no one thinks about until it matters. The cutoff that moves a name from a pending list onto the working rosters that actually let a person function inside a secure building. My permanent access badge, the one that would clear me onto the operations floor and through the door of the situation room, was stuck in the ordinary machinery of processing and would not be active until Thursday. It was Monday. "Until Thursday," Faraday said, "the floor runs off a printed roster and you are not on it yet. I can have you escorted anywhere you need to go. I just need a little notice so I can arrange it." I told her that was fine. I meant it. A 3-day gap between arriving and being fully cleared is nothing. It is the normal friction of a system that is supposed to be hard to enter. I had been on the other side of that friction 1,000 times, and I had always respected it. I was not going to spend my first week resenting a building for being careful. What I did not fully appreciate, sitting in that chair, was how the pieces were already lining up. I understood the roster problem. I did not yet understand the second piece, the one Faraday mentioned almost in passing as she gathered her folders. "One more thing you should know," she said. "The posture went up overnight, all the way up. There was a credible report, and the command tightened to its highest force protection setting a little after 0200. So everyone at every door is going to be at their most careful today, ma'am, which, given the roster thing, is not ideal timing." I remember the small, cold feeling that passed through me at that. Not fear, something more like recognition. I had spent my whole career watching systems behave, and I knew what happens when you combine a rule that runs on lists with a day when everyone has been told that the threat is real. The list becomes the only truth in the room. Anyone not on it becomes, in the tired and frightened mind of a person guarding a door, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be verified. I said something to Faraday about wanting to look at the credentialing process once I was settled, because even in that first hour, I could see the shape of the flaw. The system had no fast way to say yes to a real person who was simply missing from a list. It could only say no. A door that can only say no is not actually secure. It is just brittle, and brittle things break at the worst possible moment. I remember thinking the system was one bad morning away from doing something stupid. I did not yet know I would be the bad morning. That evening, before the first day that mattered, I called Beauchamp. He is 71 now, retired for 2 decades, and he still answers the phone like he is expecting a report. I told him I was reporting in, that I had the biggest job of my life, and that my badge would not be ready for 3 more days. He laughed, a low, dry sound I have known for 25 years. "Good," he said. "Walk in like a guest then, not like you own the place." You never own the place, General. You just get trusted to guard it for a while. I told him I remembered the lesson. He told me remembering a lesson and living it under pressure are 2 different animals, and that I would find out which one I was made of soon enough. Then he asked about my niece, and we talked about ordinary things, and I went to bed early with my uniform laid out on the chair, the way I have laid it out 10,000 times. The roster problem was still unsolved. I told myself it would sort itself out at the door. I had spent my life at doors. I trusted them. It would not sort itself out at the door. It would come apart at the door, in front of a dozen people, in a way I could not have scripted if I had tried. But that was tomorrow. That night I slept well, a guest in a new city, a woman who still believed that showing up early and standing in line was all the humility a first morning would require. I have thought a great deal since about how calm I was. I think it matters. I did not walk into what happened carrying a chip on my shoulder or a point to prove. I walked into it as relaxed as I have ever been on a first day, which is how I know that everything I did in the corridor came from the bottom of me, from the part that Beauchamp built, and not from some performance of grace I put on because I knew a camera was watching. I did not know a camera was watching. I only knew the lesson. Guard the door for everybody, especially when it is hard. The next morning, I found out exactly how hard. I arrived early, the way I always do, and I made my way through the outer checkpoints without trouble because my temporary paperwork covered the building itself. The trouble was not the building. The trouble was the one door inside it that mattered most, the door to the situation room and the operations floor behind it. And the young man standing in front of that door with a printed roster and a night of being told the threat was real. His name, I would learn, was Dominic Fewell. He was a staff sergeant, 29 years old, military police, and he was standing his access control post the way a person stands a post when they have decided that today is the day nothing gets past them. I could see it in his shoulders before I ever reached him. I have worn that posture myself. It is the posture of someone who is afraid of failing and has decided that rigidity is the same thing as strength. I stopped at his desk and I gave him my name and my billet, plainly, the way you announce yourself when you understand that the other person's job is to doubt you. "Good morning, Sergeant," I said. "Major General Ashcroft, reporting in as the new Director of Operations. My permanent badge is still in processing, my orders posted late, so I may not be on today's roster yet. I would appreciate it if you would call the watch floor and verify me. You can ask for the Deputy Director of Operations by name." He looked at me, and he looked at his list, and he did the thing I had been afraid he would do. He treated the list as the only truth in the room. "You don't have access, ma'am," he said. You're not on my roster, and today of all days, that's a hard no. I kept my voice level. I told him I understood the posture was elevated, that his caution was appropriate, and that all I was asking was for him to make one phone call to verify who I was before he turned me away. I was not asking him to wave me through on my word. I was asking him to check. Verification is not the same as access. A good door verifies. That is the whole point of a door. Something in my calm seemed to make him more suspicious rather than less, which I have since come to understand is what fear does to a certain kind of person. A frightened guard reads composure as a trick. He straightened. His hand moved to the equipment on his belt, and he said the sentence that I will hear in the back of my mind for the rest of my life. People like you don't just walk into the most secure room in the country, he said, hands behind your back. I want to be precise about what happened next because it is easy, telling a story like this, to make yourself into a saint and the other person into a monster, and that is not what this was. He was not a monster. He was a young man who had been handed a rule and a fear and no good way to hold both at once. And in that moment, he chose the worst available option and executed it carefully. He came around the desk, he took my wrists, and he bound them with a plastic restraint, a zip tie, the kind you can buy in a hardware store. And he guided me down to sit against the corridor wall like a detainee in front of the staff who were beginning to arrive for the morning watch. I did not resist. I did not pull rank in the sense of making my stars into a weapon. I gave him my name and my billet one more time, evenly. And then I stopped talking and let him do the wrong thing carefully. I sat against the wall with my wrists bound in front of me, and I made a decision that I did not experience as a decision at all, because it came from too deep to feel like a choice. I decided that I would not become, in that hallway, the very thing I had spent my life refusing to be. I would not turn my rank into a cudgel to punish a frightened man for guarding a door. The door was not the problem. The door was doing its job. The man had escalated past his job, and that would have to be dealt with, but it would be dealt with correctly, later, not settled in a corridor by a general shouting her way through a plastic tie. So I sat, and I waited, and I watched the morning happen around me. Not everyone froze. That detail matters to me more than almost any other, and I want to make sure it does not get lost. There was a young soldier at the desk behind fuel, a private first class named Wren Kessler, 21 years old, so new that everything about the building was still enormous to her. She was not frozen. She was horrified, openly, the way you are only allowed to be before the service teaches you to hide it. And while Fuel's back was turned, she picked up the desk phone and began, quietly and with shaking hands, to try to raise the watch floor herself. She did not know who I was. She only knew that what she was watching was wrong, and that the right response to something wrong is not to pick a side, but to reach for the phone and get an adult on the line. I have thought about her courage a great deal. It was the smallest and the largest thing in that hallway. Inside the situation room, behind the door I could not pass, a colonel named Desmond Achebe was the deputy director of operations, and he was watching the corridor camera the way a good watch officer watches everything, out of the corner of a trained and tired eye. He saw a woman in a uniform sitting on the floor with her wrists bound, and then he saw her face, and he placed it, because he had spent the previous week reading the file on the incoming J-3 and looking at the photograph clipped to the front of it. He did not hesitate. He keyed the secure net, and his voice came back through the speaker, mounted on the corridor wall, flat and fast and absolutely certain, the way a good order always sounds. "Stand down," the radio said. "Cut those ties. That is the J-3. The corridor went still in a way I have only felt a few times. The stillness that arrives when a room's understanding of itself changes in a single second. Fuel froze. Kessler put the phone down. The arriving staff, who had been carefully not looking at me, looked at me, and I sat there for one more breath, my wrists still bound, and I felt something I did not expect, which was not triumph. It was tiredness, and under the tiredness, a strange tenderness for the young man standing over me who had just realized what he had done. Someone produced a small knife. The plastic tie was cut. I rubbed my wrists once where the plastic had left two pale lines, and I stood up. And then I did the only thing I knew how to do. I did not reach for outrage. I reached for the door. Colonel Achebe met me just inside it, and I have rarely seen a man so undone by something that was not even his fault. He is a serious officer, and he was almost gray with it. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't have words for what just happened out there." I told him not to spend any. There would be time for words later, and there would be a right way to say them, and a corridor full of watching soldiers was neither the time nor the way. What the floor needed at that moment was its operations director, present and steady, taking the watch. So that is what I did. "Then let's not spend any," I said. "Give me the turnover." And he did. He walked me through the overnight, the posture, the credible report that had driven the whole command to its highest setting, the picture of the world as it stood that morning. I took it all in, and I asked the questions I would have asked on any first day. And within a few minutes, the room stopped being a place where a general had just been zip-tied in the hallway and became simply the operations floor, doing its work, with a new director learning its rhythm. I ran my first morning. My wrists ached a little. I did not mention it. I want to describe the composure I felt, because I do not think it was a performance, and I do not think it was cold. It was the opposite of cold. It came from caring so much about the door that I refused to damage it in order to avenge myself on the man who had guarded it badly. If I had made that morning about my humiliation, I would have taught the entire command exactly the wrong lesson. I would have taught them that access is about rank, that the way to move through that building is to be important enough that no one dares stop you. That is the precise opposite of everything I believe. A door that lets the general through because she is the general, but zip-ties the private who is missing from a list, is not secure. It is just servile. I did not want a servile door. I wanted a door that guards everyone, including me, including the next person nobody's waiting for. So I took the watch and I let the morning settle, and I waited until the end of the day to begin the slow work of doing something about it correctly. That evening, Faraday came to see me, and she was angry in the clean, protective way that good aides are angry on behalf of the people they serve. She had heard the whole thing described 5 different ways by 5 different people, and every version made her want someone's head. "Ma'am," she said, "I have to be honest, I am having a hard time with how calm you are about this." He put a general in restraints in a hallway. "Heads should roll." I told her I understood the feeling, and that I had felt a version of it myself for about 4 seconds in the corridor before something older took over. Then I tried to say the thing I most needed her, and eventually the whole command, to understand. I told her there were 2 separate failures that morning, and that if we blurred them together, we would fix neither. The first failure was the door being hard. That was not a failure at all. That was the door working. On a day when the threat was real, a young NCO refused to let an unverified person into the most sensitive room in the building. Strip away everything else, and that is exactly what I would want him to do. I did not want to punish a man for guarding a door. The second failure was the escalation. He had a means to verify me, a phone, and a watch floor 1 call away, and instead of using it, he had gone straight to physical restraint. That was the error, not the challenge. The challenge was right. The restraint, when a phone call was available, was wrong. And it was the kind of wrong that a system teaches, not just a person, because the system had given him a rule that could only say no, and a night of fear, and no fast way to say yes to a real person missing from a list. So no, I told Faraday. Heads should not roll, but the escalation cannot stand as if it were nothing, and the door has to be rebuilt so that the next person who is missing from a list gets verified instead of tied up. The person and the process. We are going to deal with both, and we are going to keep them separate. I could see her turning it over, testing it for the trapdoor she suspected was in it, the way sharp people do when a senior officer says something that sounds too measured to be entirely honest. So I gave her the rest of it, the part underneath the part. I told her that the reason I would not let my rank drive the consequence was not softness, and it was not some performance of being above it all. It was that I had watched, more than once in my career, a powerful person's anger become the whole story of an incident, until everyone forgot the actual failure and remembered only how frightening it had been to be near the anger. When that happens, the system learns exactly the wrong lesson. It learns to fear the powerful, not to fix the flaw. The next NCO at that door would not think, I must build a better way to verify people. He would think, I must never, ever stop someone who might turn out to be important. And that is how you get a door that waves through anyone with enough confidence and enough insignia, which is to say a door that has stopped being a door. I did not survive nearly 30 years of guarding thresholds to hand this command a threshold that only guards against the unimportant. She did not love it. She wanted it to be simpler, cleaner, more satisfying, but she is a professional, and she heard the sense in it, and she nodded and got to work. Later I called Beauchamp again, because there was no one else alive who would understand the exact shape of what I was feeling. I told him the whole thing, the roster, the posture, the zip tie, the radio. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked me the only question that mattered to him. "Did you pull rank in that hallway?" he said. "When he had you on the floor, did you make your stars do the talking?" I told him no. I told him I had given my name and my billet, and then I had gone silent and let it play out. "Then that's the whole win, General," he said. "You guarded the door even while you were sitting on the floor next to it. Most people can't do that. Now here's the rest of it. Make sure the fix is bigger than the man. If all you do is burn one sergeant, you learned nothing and you taught nothing. Go fix the door." The process, not the person. I wrote it in my notebook that night, those 5 words, and I underlined the first 3. Then I went back and watched the corridor footage alone, once, all the way through, not to feed my anger, but to understand exactly what had happened. And that is when I saw Kessler, the young private, picking up the phone behind Fuel's back, her hands shaking, trying to get an adult on the line. The right instinct had been in that hallway the entire time. It had just been standing in the most junior body in the room. I made a note of her name too, and I underlined it. I set my response deliberately over the following days, and I held it against pressure from both directions, because there is always pressure from both directions. Some people wanted the whole thing to disappear, to spare the command the embarrassment of having zip-tied its own general in her first week. Other people wanted Fuel destroyed, wanted him made an example of, wanted the satisfying spectacle of a career ended. I refused both, and refusing both is lonelier than picking a side. I started with the provost marshal, a lieutenant colonel named Corwin Ashby, who ran the military police and who arrived in my office, visibly braced for me to demand blood. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to be straight with you. With the 2 stars, the complainant, this can be as heavy as you want it. You tell me how hard, and I will make it that hard." I told him that was exactly the problem and exactly what I did not want. I told him I was not going to be the complainant. If the weight of this fell on Fuel because a general was angry, then the lesson everyone learned would be that the rules bend to rank, which is the same broken lesson from the other direction. I wanted it weighed on the standard, not on my stars. "I'm not the complainant," I said. "The standard is. A soldier used physical restraint on an unverified person when a means of verification was 1 phone call away. Weigh it on that. The standard says the challenge was right and the escalation was wrong. Then that is the finding, and it would be the finding whether I were a general or a brand new private. Weigh it on the standard, Colonel, not on me." He looked at me for a long moment, and then something in his posture eased, because I think he had expected to spend the next month managing a general's grudge and had just been handed something cleaner and harder instead. He said he would run it straight. I believed him. Then came the senior staff officer who caught me in a hallway a day later and suggested, in the gentle, indirect way these things are always suggested, that the smart move might be to let it quietly go away. First week, new general. Why start off by airing dirty laundry? Why not just fix the badge and move on and let the sergeant off with the talking to and spare everyone the paperwork and the awkwardness? I understood the impulse. I did not accept it. Erasing the incident would have taught the door nothing. It would have said that what happened did not matter, that a man can put an unverified person in restraints, and the only consequence is that everyone agrees never to speak of it. That is how brittle systems stay brittle. They fail, and everyone is embarrassed, and the embarrassment gets managed instead of the failure, and so the failure waits patiently to happen again to someone with less rank and less protection than a 2-star general. I was not going to let that happen on my floor. "I appreciate the instinct to protect the command," I told him. "But we do not protect the command by hiding its mistakes from itself. We protect it by fixing them in the open. This one is going to be fixed in the open." Fuel, meanwhile, was notified that he was being pulled from the access detail pending review. I did not deliver that news myself, on purpose. This was not going to be a scene between him and me, the general and the sergeant, the powerful and the humbled. It was going to move through the ordinary channels, because that is where it belonged. I heard, secondhand, that he took it badly at first, that he was defensive, that he kept saying he had been following the posture, that the threat was real, that he had done what he was trained to do. And the thing is, he was half right, and the half that was right was probably the hardest part for him, because it meant the error was not that he had cared too much about the door. It was that he had cared about it in the wrong way, and he could not yet see the difference. I signed the tasking that opened a full look at the credentialing process before any disciplinary paperwork on fuel was even complete. That order mattered to me. I wanted the record to show that the fix to the process moved before the consequence to the person, because that is the priority I actually held. The person was a day's work. The process was the whole point. The review took its time, the way a fair review should. And when it came back, it said what I already knew it would say, because it weighed the thing on the standard the way I had asked. The challenge was justified. On a day at the highest posture, stopping an unverified person from entering the situation room was not just acceptable, it was correct. But the physical restraint was not justified because Fuel had available means to verify my identity and to detain me safely without ties while he did so. A phone call, a radio, a supervisor. Any of them would have resolved the situation in minutes without a zip tie. He had reached past all of them to the most forceful option available, and that was the error, and the finding named it plainly. Fuel was formally counseled and reassigned off the access detail. Not discharged, not destroyed. Reassigned, with the error on his record, to duties where he could serve without standing at the threshold he had mishandled. The consequence was real, and it stuck, and it was proportionate to what he had actually done wrong, which was not guarding the door, but escalating past his authority while guarding it. I did not watch him receive the news, and I did not seek out the aftermath, and I want to be clear that this was a discipline I imposed on myself rather than an indifference I happened to feel. It would have been easy, and a little sweet in the low way that revenge is sweet, to know the details of his humbling. I made a point of not knowing them. I did not need to watch him fall to feel the point had landed. I made a point of not watching. What I heard, again secondhand, was that somewhere in those weeks the story he had been telling himself came apart. The story where vigilance is always a virtue, where the man who does the most forceful thing is the man who cares the most, where being hard is the same as being right. That story cracked, quietly, in a barracks room, without me in it. Which is exactly how a real change happens. Not in a dramatic scene where the powerful person delivers a lesson and the humbled person weeps and reforms. That kind of scene is a fantasy, and it is usually more about the ego of the person delivering the lesson than the growth of the person receiving it. Real change happens alone later, when the person finally sees the thing for themselves and no one is around to perform it for. I knew that about change because I had lived the other side of it. Early in my career, I had been corrected hard by people who thought that humiliating me was the same as teaching me, and it never was. The lessons that changed me were never the ones delivered with an audience. They were the quiet ones, the Beauchamp ones, the sentence said low and then left alone to do its slow work while I stood there feeling my face go hot and pretending I had not heard it. A lesson needs room to land. If you crowd it with your own satisfaction, with your need to be seen delivering it, you smother the very thing you were trying to grow. So I gave Fuel room, not because I was generous, because I understood the mechanics of it. A man who is busy resenting the general who crushed him is a man who never gets around to examining himself. I did not want to be the thing he resented. I wanted to be absent from his reckoning entirely, so that when the reckoning came, it would be his and no one else's, and it would therefore be real. In parallel, the process review turned up the flaw I had felt in my first hour in the building, the one I had mentioned to Faraday before it ever bit me. Inbound personnel with late posting orders could be entirely absent from the access roster, and the door had no fast, identity-based way to resolve that. It could confirm a name on a list. It could not verify a real person who was simply missing from the list. So its only move, its only available answer to a real officer standing in front of it with valid but unprocessed orders was no. And on a high posture day, in the hands of a frightened NCO, no had turned into a zip tie. I remember sitting with the process map spread across my desk, the boxes and arrows that were supposed to represent how a person moves from arriving to being cleared and finding the exact place where a general officer had fallen through. There was a red line where the fallback should have been and was not. I put my pen on it and left it there for a while. That gap had not cared that I was a 2-star. It would have swallowed anyone. It had simply happened to swallow me in front of witnesses in a way loud enough that the command could no longer pretend the gap was not there. Most people who fall through a gap like that do it quietly, and no one important is watching, and nothing changes. I had fallen through it loudly. That was the one useful thing about the whole morning. It made the gap impossible to ignore. So we did not ignore it. We rebuilt the door. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where the temptation is to reach for reconciliation, for the warm scene where the general and the sergeant shake hands and everyone learns and grows. That scene did not happen, and I did not want it to happen, and I think its absence is the truest thing about how this actually resolved. What happened instead was a redesign. Not a hug, a redesign. I chaired a working group, and I gave it a single stubborn instruction. I wanted a door that could say yes to the right person in 90 seconds and still say no to the wrong one. That was the whole assignment. Not a door that only says no, because a door that only says no is brittle and cruel and fails the people it should protect. And not a door that says yes too easily, because that is not a door at all. I wanted both halves of Beauchamp's lesson built into the machinery itself. Guard the door. For everybody, including the person who is missing from the list through no fault of their own. We built a fast identity verification fallback at the threshold, tied directly to the watch floor, so that when someone arrived who was not on the roster, the person at the door had a rapid, structured way to confirm who they were, rather than a binary choice between waving them through on faith or putting them in restraints. A real answer for the real case that had broken us. It was not glamorous work. It was forms and procedures and a small station and a lot of arguing about details. It was exactly the kind of unglamorous fix that prevents the next loud failure, and the 10 quiet ones after that. There were people who fought me on it, and I want to be fair to them because their objections were not stupid. Some argued that any fallback at the door was a new seam and that a determined adversary studies seams. They were right that it was a seam. Every door is a seam. The question is never whether a door has a seam, because a door that had no way to open would not be a door, it would be a wall. And a wall is not what a working command needs. The question is whether the seam is designed and watched, or accidental and unguarded. The old gap was accidental and unguarded, and it had already failed once in the loudest possible way. What we built was a seam we chose on purpose, tied to the watch floor, logged, reviewed, and narrow enough that a real person could pass through it in 2 minutes while a false one could not talk their way through at all. I spent hours in those rooms making that case, sentence by sentence, to officers who had every right to push back. And I did not pull rank to win a single one of those arguments. I won them the same way I wanted the whole thing won, on the standard, by being right about the door and patient enough to prove it. By the end, the people who had fought me hardest were the ones defending the design to others, which is the only kind of victory in staff work that actually lasts. Somewhere in those weeks, Fuel did something I did not ask him to do, and did not expect. He submitted, unprompted, a written statement. In it he owned the escalation as a lapse in judgment, and he drew the same distinction I had been drawing all along between the challenge, which he still believed was right, and the restraint, which he now understood was wrong. He did not grovel, he did not ask for anything. He just put on the record that he understood the difference now. I read it. I noted it. I let it count in his file because it should count. A man owning his error on his own is worth something, and the record should say so. And then I did not turn it into a scene. I did not summon him for a moving conversation. I did not adopt him as a project or a redemption story or a way to feel generous about myself. I let his statement be his, standing on its own, earning him a step back on its own terms. He was not mine to fix. He was a grown soldier who had made an error and was, in his own time and his own way, beginning to answer for it. The most respectful thing I could do was let that be his and not make it about me. The person I did make a point of recognizing was Kessler, the young private first class who had picked up the phone with shaking hands while everyone else in that corridor was busy choosing a side. I had her recognized formally, and when I did it, I made sure the recognition was about the instinct and not about me. I did not want it recorded as the private who helped the general. I wanted it recorded as the soldier who, seeing something wrong, reached for the phone and tried to get the right people on the line, instead of freezing or picking a side. I told her as much in the one short conversation we had about it. You reached for the phone when everyone else reached for a side, I said. Remember that you did that. That instinct is the whole job. Most people take 20 years to learn it. You already have it. Do not let anyone train it out of you. She looked like she might cry, and then she squared herself and said, "Yes, ma'am." And I let her go back to work, because the kindest thing you can do for a young soldier having a large feeling is to give them somewhere ordinary to put it. The new verification station went live at the corridor threshold quietly, without ceremony, on an ordinary morning, which is exactly how the good changes always arrive. No ribbon, no speech. Just a small station that had not been there before, humming softly, ready to do the one thing the old door could not, which was to say yes to a real person in a hurry, without giving up the right to say no. Weeks passed. I want to tell you about those weeks because they are where the actual meaning of the thing lived, and it did not live in the drama of the corridor. It lived in the quiet afterward, in whether anything had actually changed or whether we had all just performed a lesson and moved on. The command looked the same from the outside. It always does. The beige building sat there being unremarkable, giving away nothing about what moved through it, but underneath it ran differently. I moved through the corridor now with my badge live and my name on every list, and the once hostile threshold was just a threshold again, with a small new station beside it that had made the whole place a little more like the thing I believed a secure building should be. I did not declare victory. I have watched too many people declare victory over a problem that was quietly reassembling itself behind them. I waited for the real test, the one that would not involve me at all, because the measure of the fix was never going to be whether the general could get through the door. Of course the general could get through the door now. My name was on every list. The system had learned me the hard way. The measure was going to be the next person nobody was waiting for. That test came a few weeks in. Another officer arrived, late orders, same roster gap, the exact situation that had put me on the floor with my wrists bound. Except this time the door did what I had built it to do. The person at the threshold used the new verification fallback, raised the watch floor, confirmed the officer's identity through the structured process, and cleared her in under 2 minutes. No waving through on faith, no zip tie, no frightened binary between the two worst options. Just a real answer to a real case, delivered in the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee. I heard about it after the fact, the way you hear about the systems you build working correctly, which is to say almost by accident, because working correctly makes no noise. The officer it happened to never knew there had been a problem to solve. That is the part I keep returning to. She walked up to a door she was missing from a list through no fault of her own, and instead of the worst morning of her career, she got 2 ordinary minutes and a nod and a cleared entry, and she went on to her meeting without ever learning that a general had once sat on the floor of that exact corridor with her wrists bound so that those 2 minutes could exist. She will never thank anyone for it, because you cannot thank someone for a thing you never knew was in danger of going wrong. That is the nature of prevention. It is invisible by design. The failures are loud, and they have names, and everyone remembers them. The fixes are silent and anonymous, and they save people who never find out they were saved. I made my peace, a long time ago, with doing work that leaves no monument. The monument is a stranger getting through a door in 2 minutes, and never knowing why it was easy. I will take that over a plaque every day of my life. And I sat with it for a moment, and I felt the thing I had been waiting weeks to feel. The measure of it was never going to be me. It was going to be the next person nobody was waiting for. And the next person nobody was waiting for had walked up to my door, and my door had guarded her the way I would have wanted it to guard me. That was the whole of it. That was the win. And it was quiet, and it made no noise at all. And I would not have traded it for the loudest apology in the world. I took stock in the honest way you are only able to once enough time has passed that you are no longer performing your own feelings. The man who had tied my wrists was gone from the detail, held to a real and proportionate consequence, answering for his error in his own time. The gap that had swallowed me was closed. The young soldier who had done the right thing had been told, plainly, that she had done the right thing. And I had never once, in any of it, had to raise my voice. That last part matters to me more than I can easily explain. I had spent my whole career being told, in 100 small ways, that a woman in a room full of soldiers has to be louder to be heard, harder to be respected, sharper to be safe. And here was the largest test of my career, and I had passed it by being quiet, by trusting the door and the standard and the slow, correct machinery of an institution doing its job, by refusing to make my rank into a weapon, even when a weapon was right there in my hand and a man had just given me every excuse to use it. One morning, walking the corridor, I stopped at the exact spot on the wall where I had sat with my wrists bound. I do not fully know why I stopped. To mark it, maybe. To make sure I remembered the shape of it, the pale lines the plastic had left, the tiredness, the strange tenderness. I stood there for a moment, and then I walked on, because a spot on a wall is only a spot on a wall, and the work was down the corridor, on the floor, waiting. The morning I am thinking of when I think of how this ends was an ordinary one. I was on the operations floor, in command of the watch, the room's rhythm moving around me the way it does when a lot of competent people are quietly doing difficult work well. I stood at the center of it, the director of operations, running the floor behind the door I had once been forbidden to pass, and I let myself feel, for just a second, the full circle of it. There is a particular peace in occupying, calmly and by right, a space that once refused you. It is not triumph. Triumph is loud and it curdles. This was quiet and it kept. Across the floor I caught Kessler's eye. She was steadier now, trusted with more, growing into the service the way the good ones do. We did not make a moment of it. She gave me the smallest nod, the kind that passes between two people who were in the same hallway on the same bad morning, and both, in their own way, reached for the phone instead of aside. Then she went back to her work, and I went back to mine, and that was all it needed to be. The right instinct, recognized and rewarded, was taking root in someone 21 years old, and it would outlast me, and that is the only kind of legacy that has ever actually meant anything to me. That night I called Beauchamp one last time to close the loop with the only person who had been there for the beginning of the lesson 25 years earlier. I told him the whole arc of it, the fix, the test, the young soldier, the quiet of it. He listened the way he always listens, and when I was done, he asked me the question I should have known he would ask. "So did you ever get your door, General?" he said. "The one you were stuck outside of that first morning." I thought about it, and I told him the truth. "I got a better one," I said. "I got a door that guards everybody, including the person nobody's waiting for. Including me, if I ever show up late again. That is the one you actually want. Not the door that lets you through because you are important. The door that guards the standard for everyone, even when it is inconvenient, even when the person standing at it is a 2-star general with sore wrists." He was quiet, and then he laughed, that low, dry sound I have known for a quarter of a century. "Sounds like you finally learned to guard a door, General," he said. I have carried that sentence with me ever since, the way I carried the first one from the firebase all those years ago. Because that is what it was all about in the end. Not the humiliation in the corridor, not the zip tie or the radio or the young man who made the wrong choice carefully and is now, I hope, becoming a better soldier for it. It was about what a door is for and who it is supposed to guard and whether you have the discipline to hold that line even when you are the one sitting on the floor beside it with your hands bound. So let me say this to you directly. Whoever you are, wherever you are listening from, if you have ever been made to stand outside something you had every right to walk into, if you have ever been stopped, doubted, dismissed, or bound up in someone else's fear, I want you to hear the part that took me nearly 30 years to learn. The answer is not to become the thing that hurt you. The answer is not to turn your own rank, whatever your rank happens to be, into a weapon to punish the frightened. The answer is to hold the line the way you would want it held for you. To fix the door instead of burning the man. To guard the standard for everyone, especially when it would be easier and sweeter to guard it only for yourself. That is not weakness. I know it can look like weakness from the outside, the quiet of it, the refusal to shout. It is not weakness. It is the whole job. I turned back to the floor as the watch rolled on, my wrists long since unmarked, the door behind me doing exactly what a door should do. And I have never, in nearly 30 years of standing at thresholds, felt more like I was finally standing at the right one. I've told you the whole of it now, the corridor, the zip tie, the radio, and the quiet work that came after. If you've ever been made to wait outside something you had every right to walk into, I'd really like to hear how you handled it. Did you raise your voice, or did you hold the line the quiet way? Would you have pressed harder on the sergeant than I did, or would you have done what I did and fixed the door instead of burning the man? And do you think I got that balance right? Tell me in the comments because I read them and I learned from them. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay a while. I'd be glad to have you here.